Welcome to part 2 of the Teacher Candidate Work Sample. Within this tutorial, we are going to discuss how to plot and analyze the data according to your pre and post assessments. In tutorial number 1, you were given the option to have 1 or 2 outcomes and at least 10 questions on your pre and post test. This is an example of a pre-test that has 2 outcomes, because you see outcome number 1 right here, and outcome number 1 has 5 questions, which means if this were my pretest, I would have 2 outcomes with 5 questions each. So here, once you collect your pre-assessment information from your students, you're actually going to plot each individual child's answers. If the answer is correct, then you put the correct answer. If the answer is wrong, you put what they chose as their incorrect answer. If they got the answer incorrect, you're also going to note why you believe that is, why that occurred. And so, did they choose the wrong answer because the question was confusing? Did they choose the wrong answer because they didn't explain with text evidence how they got the right answer, so they didn't complete the entire thing? Did they not show their regrouping, carry a digit, and therefore added incorrectly in the hundreds column? So what is the mistake? Can you identify the mistake in thinking or misconception that they have for getting the wrong answer? And you'll do that for each question on the test. Once you note each student's answer, then you can determine how well each individual student did by going across the row. So if student number 1 got every single question right out of these 5 out of 5 is 100%. Student number 2 only got 4 out of the 5 correct, which would be 80%. Student number 3 got 3 out of the 5 correct, which would be 60%. Notice that I have student 1, 2, 3. Remember, you cannot give us any identifying information, including initials and or student ID numbers. So you want to just label the students 1, 2, 3, 4. You do need to make sure that you have a way to know that student number 1 on the pretest is student number 1 on the post-test, so that the data for the students align. So once you've collected information on how well each individual student did, 100%, 80%, 60%, so forth and so on, you can also use this pre-assessment data to look at the individual questions. So if question number 1 is of a lower rigor, and everyone in the class got question number 1 correct, 100%, then you don't need to spend much time covering that within a class. You can quickly review the information and move on. However, question number 2, a lot more students did not get it correct. And so it might be a higher level of rigor about the content. And so this would be a question and a concept you would want to spend more time on in whole group and small group instruction, so that the kids can be thinking about the content in that higher level. So again, this chart, you're going to take the pre-assessment data and you're going to break it down by question, so that you can determine, is the question at the level of rigor that it needs to be? What concepts do you need to take more time on? What concepts can you just review and move on to? And then worst case scenario is everyone in the class does really well or masters the pretest, then you're looking at either realigning your assessment or teaching a different content altogether. So if you see here, this would be for outcome 1 with 5 questions, and this last column is purple, which leads us to the next slide. Here you're going to use the purple from the last slide, and you're going to fill in these blanks that I have highlighted for you. So student number 1, again, no initials, no names, no identifying numbers. Student number 1, and you're going to tell that was outcome number 1 with 5 questions. What percent did he have correct? 100%. Student number 2 had 80%. Student number 3 had 60%. And so again, you have to have at least 10 questions. That was only 5 questions, so I would have had another outcome, and then I put how much percent correct did the student have here. And so with this information, I can determine where the students lie before I teach them their 5-day unit. Now I've determined where the students were pre-assessment and before I taught them their 5 days of instruction, and I taught them 5 days of instruction, and now I'm at my post assessment. And again, the chart looks the same because I'm giving the same format and the same content kind of test with different answers. And so again, my student number one from the pre is going to be my student number one from the post. I'm going to put their answer, and if it's wrong, I'm going to try and determine why they got it wrong. And you come across the row and you determine how well the student did individually. So this one might be 100, 180. Which means this child stayed the same, this child improved by 20%, and this child improved by 20%. And again, you can go down the column. So here I can go student to student number one to student number one, pre and post. I can go the group of students from pre and post overall. I can go individual questions, pre and post by student and for the entire group. So these two charts that you're doing on pre and post really allow you to not just identify their mastery of the content, but their level of learning of each question and each content within each question as individuals and as a group. If you notice on the last slide, the last column was green. So just as before, whenever we were doing pre-assessment purple, so student number one, what was their percent correct? And you'll fill it in here. Then you're going to determine from purple to green. So their pre-assessment was 100%, and it's still 100%. There was no gain. Student number two had 80% and then 100%, so it was a 20% gain. You want to make sure that every column on this chart is filled in. And within the comments section, you are saying what you identify as a misconception or an error in student work. Or if the students got 100% mastery, then they would be ready to move on to a higher level of learning or engage in a different activity. So every column and every row of this chart must be completed. Again, you'll have data in these two and then tell if they've regressed or progressed, how much, and then every student will have a comment about their learning. Now that you've completed the previous chart, you're ready to determine the number and percent of students that have now mastered the concept, the number and percentage of students that have not mastered the concepts, and then what factors contributed to the success and failure of these students. So, is there an issue with the instructional strategies that you used? Did the assessment not align with the rigor of the standard? Too easy or too hard, either way. Was there confusing questions on the test that maybe weren't valid and reliable and can't be used for the data? So what did you contribute student success or failure to as determined by things that you influenced, which is not necessarily a student wasn't motivated to participate or something like that. What are factors that you had control of that impacted the success and failure of the students in your class? After you've determined your student success and failures, can you pinpoint gaps and where they are in their learning, or patterns or where they are in their learning? So we're looking at did your students progress or not, and how much did they grow or decline? So the previous one was give me a number and a percent and tell me why. This is looking at overall. Can you identify patterns in understanding or gaps in knowledge about the unit? So now that you've taught 5 days and you're assessing them again for the second time as a post-assessment, what are you still seeing as ideas and concepts they are not getting, and how are you proving that information? So what in your comments section? They're not regrouping. They're not using text evidence. What are you seeing overall that they are not scoring mastery on the specific post-test that you gave? After you've taught your unit and done your post-assessment data charts, you are now going to group students into small groups of no more than 6. And within those small groups of 6, you are identifying students by ability, interest, learning styles to group them. So in groups of no more than 6, you're going to tell us what students you've included, no identifying information, just students' numbers, number 1, 4, 7, and 8. How did I group them? These students all missed question number 6. What activity, strategy, methods do I plan to implement? This has to be different than the 5 days of instruction and also different by groups. So if you have a high, medium, and a low group, those high, medium, and low students are not going to be doing the same activity. And then how did you come about choosing this activity, and how do you know that it's going to address the gaps in learning? So again, what are the students that are included? Tell us their number. How did you group them? Was it an assessment? Was it a common error they had? How did you come up with that information? What activity method did you choose to implement in your RTI? And then how did that specific strategy, how is it going to help their gap in learning? So your high kids, whatever their number is, how are you going to group them? They all scored 100%. What activity am I going to do? You're going to add on a level of rigor. So if you were doing a math lesson and it was to complete double-digit addition, now we're going to go to triple-digit addition. And so that's going to expand their learning and fill gaps because it's going to give them a head start in the next content that you're going to cover. So you have to fill out these 4 questions for each group of 6 or less students. You have to use data to support your decision of how you made the group or how it's going to address the gap. And finally, you need to make sure that you implement these RTI small groups no later than 1 week after you finish your post-assessment. So after you finish your post-assessment, you'll do the data, create your groups, do this section of your teacher candidate work sample, and then actually implement it in the classroom to see if you can fill those holes one last time before you're done teaching the students. Now that you finalize your teacher candidate work sample, we want to know about the input you had from various stakeholders. Part 5 is communicating and follow up. So how did you communicate with students before, during, and after your teacher candidate work sample? Did you do something with their interests? Did you vote on activities they could do or assessments? Did you use some type of inventory to gain their input into what you were going to do, either the content or the activities? What did your classroom host teacher tell you about your instruction, your pre and post test, technology use in the classroom? What kinds of things did you communicate with them? And then the same thing for your colleagues. So we're looking for several things within this one square. How did you communicate with them? Surveys, face-to-face meetings, emails. What did they provide you as far as information prior, during, and after your post-assessment for your teacher candidate work sample? Question number 1 on the previous slide asked for before, during, and after communication with the 3 various types of stakeholders. Question number 2 says, how did you use that information as a result of your communication? So what did the students tell you about their interest, and that's what you implemented into your lessons. Pre and post test, your classroom teacher didn't like the alignment or the validity of some questions, so she asked you to change them. She or he asked you to change them. Your colleague gave you an idea about technology use, and you implemented that within your teacher candidate work sample 5-day lesson. So number 1 asks, who did you contact and what did they tell you about the information? And question number 2 is, what did you do as a result of the information that you learned from those 3 sets of stakeholders? Also in alignment with those 3 sets of stakeholders from question number 1 was your involvement in colleagues in your learning process. And so here we're looking at, what did you do above and beyond with your colleagues to help satisfy the implementation of this teacher candidate work sample as a high quality piece of information. So what kinds of things did your colleagues tell you about topics that you've learned within your college career about ESL or accommodations for SPED students, or activities using differentiation, multiple intelligences, learning styles? So what kind of information did your colleagues share with you and that helped your learning process of actually implementing this teacher candidate work sample as a result of your communication with them? Remember that when you're done with the teacher candidate work sample, you are going to attach your unit plan along with your pre and post assessment and student artifacts of the pre and post assessment from the class that you taught. Student names should be blacked out and identified as student 1, 2, 3 and should match the assessment chart pre and post that we have talked about through this tutorial number 2. Before submitting your teacher candidate work sample, you want to make sure that you go over the next this slide and the next slide, Part 3A and Part 4 of the assessment plan. This allows you to make sure that you have included all the information that we wanted you to and we're looking for in the teacher candidate work sample. When you're reading across this row individually, you're looking at delineators from each column to the next. So this says the candidate correctly applies and balances formal and informal measurements. So this means that you have an informal and a formal each day of the lesson. Effective proficient says that you apply formal and formal measures, so you might have a lot more informal than formal, and then so forth and so on. So you want to make sure that you look at each of these parts of Part 3A and each delineator across the row 4321, and it'll help you double check your work before you submit it for grading. The last slide, just as the slide before, covers Part 4 and has 4 columns of information to help you check and make sure you've included everything that you were supposed to. So be sure and read through the delineation of each 1, 2, 3, and 4 in order to double check your work before you submit it. If you have any questions, you can contact your university supervisor about the teacher candidate work sample or contact someone at McNeese in the Department of Education Professions, and we would be more than happy to further explain or sit with you to clarify any questions that you have about your teacher candidate work sample before you submit.